Who are you when no one's looking? I feel like this is definitely something we have to ask ourselves because we're constantly performing. We're constantly trying to fit other people's idea or perception of us. And I feel like a lot of times I've been doing things in my life only to fit other people's idea, only to kind of get validation or get agreement or support just because this is what other people expected of me or what other people wanted for me. When I have to start doing things that are important for myself, I feel like a lot of times we definitely push down the things that really could transcend us and really are important to us just because we're scared of how other people will feel, just because we're scared of being judged. And I feel like a lot of times the things that are actively for us are outside of our comfort zone. You definitely have to seek discomfort in this sense, kind of to be creative, kind of to be more self-dependent on the things that are important and for you. We have to realize that comfort definitely kills creativity. And if we kind of sit in this the whole time that we're trying to experience life, then what are we actively achieving? What are we actively looking for? I feel like a lot of times this is definitely something that people fall into when they don't even realize it. When you're actively doing things just because you see other people do it on social media is actually for you in a sense. And I feel like a lot of times this is how people have been living. It's definitely hard, but I do feel like it definitely comes with developing yourself before trying to get with other people. And I feel like this is something that people don't really try to do anymore, try to realize. Back then it was really different, but I do think if we tried more to really love ourselves more than we love other people. And it sounds selfish, but it's definitely something we have to actively start to do. If we truly want to experience love and to be able to understand and love other people, we can only understand them as deep as we know ourselves. I feel like a lot of times if we actively took the time to take care of ourselves and to see how we treat ourselves, it'd be better to look at it as if this person or of you was in a relationship with you, would you stay with them? And I feel like a lot of times we'd say no. Just because we're so negative, or just because we're so pessimistic, just because we're ruining things constantly over and over. And I feel like if we actively wanted, better things in our life, we'd understand this. We'd understand that we're actively hurting ourselves when we're saying, you're not good enough for this, or you're not deserving of this, or this is why this person treated you. And I feel like that pessimism really transcends us. It really transforms us in a better sense. And I feel like that's why it's so hard to actively be with people. When we do think about the problems that go with relationships nowadays, I feel like a lot of them are definitely internal things. They're not something that's dealing with the relationship, but rather something that people are battling on their own, rather something that people are struggling with behind closed doors. And I feel like this happens so often that we kind of have it go unnoticed. We kind of just feel like, oh, this person left me because I wasn't enough, when in reality it's the other way around. When we are actively looking to repair or replace things, I feel like this is definitely something that gets mixed up. And a lot of times people get confused by the dichotomy of this relationship. If they actively want things to get better, then they actively try to get things better. And I think that's really it. A lot of times when relationships do have problems, people feel like this isn't why I should be in a relationship. We have to realize this is the whole point of a relationship. Relationships cause problems the same way life does. And without these problems in life, how do you actively grow? How do you actively change? And I think a lot of people aren't realizing that. When we are actively looking for love, we have to realize what comes with it. We can't have all the benefits of these things in life without suffering the repercussions, without realizing that I need to do this in order to get this. There's always a good in income, and there's always an outcome. And I feel like a lot of times when we actively want a relationship, if we actively want to pursue these things in life, we have to realize it will be uncomfortable. We have to realize it will be hard. We have to realize that we will hurt in a sense. I think a lot of people only glorify love, but they don't realize that love is sacrifice. Love is a change beyond yourself. I feel like it's not really something you can contain or keep one-sided, but it's something that you're openly giving, not with the idea that it will be given back to you, but you're giving it because you want to give. You're giving it because you want to feel this way towards someone else. And I feel like a lot of people have too much pride in that sense, and they don't realize that. I feel like a lot of times pride and ego is what's draining relationships nowadays, because people won't say how they feel. They're scared of how they'll look. They're scared of how people will perceive them if they hear about this, or they tell their friends, hey, I said this to so-and-so. And I feel like that really ruins it. We're letting people that don't really care about us determine the things we care about. And I think that's what's damaging everything. If we actually do look at relationships or our lives as a whole, what are we actually doing for ourselves? I feel like a lot of times when we're thinking about our day-to-day activities, if we just tried a little harder to do these new things or to try new things, we get closer to accepting ourselves. We get closer and more comfortable with ourselves. And at that point, that's when we become more decisive. That's when we become more confident and more charismatic in that sense. When we're fully aware of the things that we're capable of and we can do, things can get easier. If we definitely took more time in that sense, what's to stop us? What will really determine the things that hurt us in the end? I feel like a lot of times when determining what controls you, we definitely rely on other people's perception. We definitely let other people determine the things that are important or not important to our life, whether that be our friends or our relationship or even our family sometimes. I think it's definitely important to keep these things grounded, you know. As important as it is, I definitely think it goes into principle of saying that these things in my life will mean something and these things in my life are things I want to pursue. You know, that groundhood and that, in a sense, is very important in itself, you know. I feel like if people wanted more confidence, if people wanted these things, these goals, these dreams, they'd understand that. And they would actually try to get there instead of just suppressing everything down and feeling like they have to fit someone else's mold. So I do think it's important that we ask ourselves, what do we actually want? You know, what drives us? What gets us out of bed every day in the morning? And I don't think everyone has that answer. But I think it's important to know. You know, and I think it's definitely something we should take the time to try to condense down. You know, we have to ask ourselves, what do we want and how are we going to get there? And I feel like a lot of times this definitely goes with purpose or even fulfillment, but I feel like it's something deeper. You know, I feel like it's something that really we can only experience on our own. When we actively look at our lives and the things that are going on, we have to realize what brings us happiness, you know, what brings us purpose. And a lot of people say, oh, well, to be successful or to get this job or to get this person. We have to realize it's not materialistic. You know, it's not something fabricated. It's something we find internally. We have to realize that a lot of times these rich or successful people aren't struggling with things on the outside. It's the inside, you know, it's the things that have hurt them or they've never kind of healed from that they felt like money would bring them or they felt like girls would bring them or guys or whatever it is. You know, I feel like a lot of times we actively want to improve and get better. We take more time in this, you know, we'd be a lot more respectful to ourselves in this sense. If we take more time to develop and to understand what we want, it'd be more easy to, you know, lock in on what it is. You know, we'd be more precise in that sense. We'd waste less time and we'd let people who try to distract us not distract us this time. We'd understand that they're only something that will drag us down or kind of keep us further from what we actively want in life. And I feel like that's really the whole point. When we precise things down and when we actually locate the things that can benefit us, that's when you start to live for yourself. You know, that's when you start to understand that you're able to do these things, you're able to move on, you're able to conquer. I think that's what's most important. And that's living a life for you instead of for other people.